I've seen fire and I've seen rain. I've seen sunny days I thought would never end. I've seen lonely times when I could not find a friend. But I always thought that I'd see you again.
Hello, welcome to the Fire and Rain Conversation series, a series designed to inform and empower bushfire-prone communities to live safely with fire.
We'd like to firstly acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're speaking from, the Gadibunud and Gulajan people, and their deep and continuous connection with the land. We acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and we're so grateful to live on this country that they have cared for tens of thousands of years.
I am Emma Ashton and this is Rachel Lopes. We live in the Otways village of Forest, Victoria, which is a high bushfire risk town. We had planned a bushfire summit in April this year, but it was cancelled due to the coronavirus. So we've adapted the summit into this series for our community and for any community prone to bushfire. After last summer's fires, we've decided to roll up our sleeves and find out what we need to know and can share with others to help us sleep better at night.
We'll be talking to traditional owners, scientists, on-ground experts, psychologists and community leaders to find out what they can teach us, what they can tell us, what they can teach us, and what they can give us as far as resources go to help us live safely with fire.
In this first episode of our conversation series, we're starting at the top to understand what the broad context is for bushfire-prone communities in Australia. Climate change, record-setting events, what are the risks? Can we live here safely going forward? And what should we be doing now to prepare?
We have two brilliant guests today who are experts in their field and truly lovely human beings. Welcome to Robert Glasser and Justin Leonard. We might ask you to introduce yourselves. Tell us the country you're speaking from and the story of why you do the work you do.
Well, first, maybe before commenting, I want to also join with you in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. I'm joining you from Ngunnawal country. I want to acknowledge the Ngunnawal leaders, past, present, and emerging as well. So what brings me to this work on climate and disaster risk? Well, I think the more I see, the more I've learned about climate, the more disturbing it is. And probably there are two elements that are extremely disturbing. One, of course, is the impacts and what it will mean for our environment, for every aspect of human life. And the second is the fact that those changes are more or less non-reversible, irreversible, at least in human timescales. And so it creates a sense of urgency. And then, even though we are beginning to see these impacts now, I think about my children. Number one, my wife and I have 3 kids, and we want to do whatever we can to not leave this dreadful legacy to them. And secondly, my work, and maybe this is part of my background, I was previously the UN Secretary General's Special Representative for Disaster Risk Reduction. Before that, I spent a lot of time in CARE Australia and CARE International, which is a very international NGO that works in developing countries in humanitarian emergencies. And I've just seen climate impacts disproportionately affecting very poor people who have contributed virtually nothing to this problem. And they're just getting walloped by wave after wave of impacts. So the inequality, the injustice of that is also motivating for me.
Thanks, Robert. And Justin?
Hi, I'm Justin Leonard. I'm residing in the Boonwurrung country. I was actually born in this location as well, so I have a real connection to this sense of place. I'm a researcher with CSIRO, and I started out in my research career looking at fire and life safety around people, and I was very quickly drawn to the topic of bushfire, mainly from an engineering perspective, understanding how houses responded in bushfires and trying to unpack the seemingly complex issues around why some houses burn down and some don't. And I guess 25 years in now into my career, it's that interesting and complex problems expanded into a very complex mix of houses, the people that live in them, the communities that try to tackle and deal with these infrequent but very nasty outcomes. And I guess how we weave a pathway through that towards adaptation and building resilience around these fires. And I guess being part of CSIRO, I'm part of a very interesting network of other researchers that have a very good handle on what our future climate has to offer, and combining the insights of where we're going in a sense of climate and what bushfire has in store for us in the future, I think gives us this really immediate and imminent need to proactively adapt rather than sort of face the unfortunate metric of maybe having to reactively adapt to how much worse bushfires are we're going to face in the future.
Yeah. Firstly, to you, Robert, last summer we experienced some of the most devastating bushfires in Australia's history across a really extensive area. And from a climate's perspective, what do you make of this, and what does it mean for the future, for not only my generation, but as you say, of our children's?
What's unusual now with the changing climate is that we're beginning to see kind of record-setting increases in the scale and frequency of many hazards, including bushfires. And we saw this late last year. I was up in Wujal, which is an Aboriginal community in far north Queensland, where in the face of the monsoonal floods that struck that community in actually northern Queensland, that completely inundated this Aboriginal community, and the Aboriginal elder, Uncle Billy, we were told, I wasn't there during the floods, we're told there was up at the river, their sacred site, actually throwing debris back into the river and yelling angrily at his ancestors for not preparing them for this, for not warning them that this flooding on this scale was possible. So tens of thousands of years of song lines and stories didn't prepare him out of that community for the scale of the Christ, the hazard that they were seeing. And that's what climate change is doing. It's increasing the frequency, and importantly, the pace of the change is accelerating. So what we've seen over the last 10 years isn't what we can expect in the next. The pace will accelerate. And fundamentally, coming back to the irreversible nature of this, because of the momentum in the climate, we're already locked into probably over 1.5 degrees of warming, which was the lower limit set in the Paris Climate Agreement that Australia and other countries signed up to. So even if we stopped producing all greenhouse gases immediately, all over the world, the climate will continue to warm pretty close to 1.5 degrees. So there's a real sense of urgency of acting now. Otherwise, we're committed to 2.5 degrees, possibly 3 degrees of warming, which would be just catastrophic.
And how do you see us addressing that sense of urgency? How do you see that playing out?
Well, I think, to some extent, picking up on what Justin said, to be proactive, it would be nice to be proactive. I think we are going to respond. The problem is because of that inertia in the climate system, by the time things are looking really bad, and we've had a taste of this in our last bushfire season, it's actually too late to prevent much more severe warming. So ultimately we will react. Ultimately the politics in Australia will change, even the Liberal government, and we will begin investing more in climate adaptation and advocating globally for deeper reductions, including reductions here in Australia. But if we wait for the disasters to force that change, it's actually too late to prevent a lot of that change. So we need to start somehow getting out ahead of that, taking every opportunity after a bushfire, for example, like this crisis, to mobilize people to act.
Yeah, and to learn. I saw you speak recently And in your address, you talked about a community in Japan, actually, and some of the strategies that they've used to adapt to risks that face their communities. Can you talk to that story?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And so in Japan, as people watching probably understand and know, that Japan is extremely exposed to earthquake, seismic hazard, and tsunami risk. And during the Great Eastern Japan earthquake, there was a major tsunami that destroyed Tohoku, a number of communities across Japan. And in my job with you, and I had an opportunity to visit a number, not just in Japan, but elsewhere, communities that have adjusted. One of the really striking features of the Japanese disaster risk reduction efforts is the role, the focus on local communities, and including on schools and school children. During that tsunami, it was a school in a multi-story high building, which was a school in Tohoku, where there was one student who had been studying tsunami risk, and he knew that when the tide went out, that meant a tsunami was coming. And he stood up, told the teacher in the class, the whole teacher and the students warned the rest of the school, and they went onto the roof just in time as the tsunami struck. So that idea of personal responsibility, both for everyone in society, individuals and adults, is really key. Japan has these markers that are ancient, hundreds of years old in many cases, that show to communities where the water came up to. The water in 16 whatever reached this point. So in communities, people walking are reminded regularly of how high the waves can come. So you have these they're not hard, they're not expensive, they're not high-tech solutions that we also see in other countries. In Japan, in Vietnam, for example, communities are shifting from chickens to ducks because ducks float in the floods and they can save some of their livestock that way, or building mounds so that they have places they can evacuate cattle to. And so there are many high-tech solutions, early warning systems, storm bunkers, but there are many low-tech solutions that communities can access.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robert. Justin, 10 years ago, we were told to stay and defend our house. And these days now we're told to, prepare and leave early. Where are we at with our understanding of bushfire, and how are things evolved over time? Why aren't we bushfire resilient as far as communities go?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I guess a complex one, in that it involves communities' attitudes and approaches to bushfire, but at the same time how they respond or interpret warning systems and laws and regulations around bushfire. And I guess the challenges we face are that our laws and regulations and warning systems even are more worded around teaching us to fear fire and to be concerned and nervous around fire. And I guess in many ways that sets up a barrier to being able to consider and adapt to and be resilient to fire and sort of engage and get a deep understanding. So in a sense, we're expanding rapidly in terms of tools and opportunities to learn about fire, and I guess the gap between the small proportion of the community that you would say are well adapted and the rest of the community that hasn't entered down that journey, I guess, is broadening over time. And I guess, even the simple messaging about leave early, and there's a threshold that you should leave by, it's a very important and clear message, and certainly solves much of the life safety risk around bushfire, but it does throw that whole spectre of issue up around this idea that we're actually abandoning our houses at a certain threshold and sort of accepting some inevitability of loss. And I guess for some, that feels like, you know, we're heading down a non-resilient path. But for others, it actually puts up the spectre that, and the ideology that we actually should be designing our houses to survive fires without us needing to physically defend them. So it's always this contrasting process depending on the mindset you come at the problem with.
Thank you, Justin. That's a minefield right there. Moving from fear to responsibility and the idea that you can design your house so that you don't lose it. Can we live safely with fire, and what might that look like?
Time and time again, I've come at the problem from an engineering perspective and saying, what does it need for us to be, you know, safe and effective in a fire? And I'm constantly reminded and always come to the conclusion that to be safe and effective in a fire, the individual that we're maybe using us to focus on, it's their knowledge and understanding is by far the most important thing, because this will influence how they perceive a fire and a fire event and make decisions to either not be there or to effectively prepare. It arms that person with the knowledge and understanding to make the right decisions if they're caught out and actually face a fire, making the right decisions to shelter in the right places, to not escalate their risk and move into more risky scenarios, and to have the right actual tactical strategies to work with other people or with the tools and the shelter locations they have around them, and also what to do immediately after and to be most effective. It really comes from that deep understanding and that deep dive into and commitment to understanding. And once that's sort of laid down, and the processes about preparing houses and considering and integrating fire and ending up with a pretty well prepared home just naturally comes.
A deep understanding and commitment by individuals. Assuming we had this, what are the steps from there to build a whole community that gets it?
So I guess in the context of being adapted as a whole community, it really takes a whole lot of enlightened individuals that become highly interactive and share their knowledge and understandings and thinking with their broader community. That achieves a whole range of things. First, you know, the one-to-one sort of knowledge sharing between people, I think, is just the key way to learn and understand about local context and share all of the stories and the processes about how bushfires can unfold and what bushfire knowledge really is. As each individual shares in that capacity and understanding spread through the community, the whole net benefit escalates significantly, because the community as a whole actually become a support network within a bushfire, and also build an effective community environment which is far more survivable and self-supporting in a bushfire context. So you can imagine you can build and maintain your house quite effectively and that's one isolated thing. But then the question is, well, your neighbour's not far away, and how well is their house prepared? And in fact, houses that are, you know, meters apart in common sort of urban interface settings have a huge amount of mutual risk, because one house can burn its neighbour down. But at the same time, neighbours can help each other out in terms of supporting and defending houses and helping people maintain and share those ideas and approaches. I guess what tends to come from that, once there is a strong community network and approach to community-wide resilience, is there's a collective conversation about how to consider the bush beyond the back fence. what its values are, what amenity it provides, and how best to address it also as a fuel road, and how to treat it in terms of modifying the bush in certain ways so that it brings less hazard to the community. And that really is a collective problem, of which many different values are mixed into the process. And really, the conversation done at a community level is the most effective way to solve that those sort of broader issues.
Thanks, Justin. Just, reminding us once again that we are all connected, and it's so important to have those conversations with our neighbours, and just, those daily conversations, and to be aware of your risk. That's how you have to do it. You have to chat, and you have to have those relationships.
So, Robert, back to you. Just in terms of what are the sort of the next steps for our communities? Could you give us a sense of what we need to turn our attention to, and perhaps a top three of what you think are the most important first steps we need to take as communities?
So I think the first point is the point just made, which is understand risk. And in that context, the past is no longer a reliable indicator for what lies ahead, because the pace of these, the severity, the frequency, the scale of these hazards are increasing because of climate change. So you need to really think about that. We didn't have a chance to talk about cascading and compound events, which will increase and which will really characterize this last bushfire season. Even assumptions about who you can rely on to provide support need to be questioned, given the increasing scale of the disasters that are likely, the hazards that are likely to strike, and consecutive hazards, simultaneous hazards. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to, of course, the questions about communities, and each community is different. It has a different exposure, vulnerability, different risks even. I started giving you the figures for cyclone risk, and climate. There's some good data that suggests that climate change is causing cyclones now to track further south into parts of Australia that haven't been designed to deal with cyclone risk. There, in Queensland, the local government areas, the communities, over the past 3 years, over half of them have had 3 or more major disasters in 3 years. And so in those communities, there's a lot of energy in the community to actually address these hazards. In some communities, their major challenge for adaptation is that they're losing business or losing knowledge because people are retiring and moving away. And so the other factor is that these issues of preparing for disasters and adapting has to be embedded in the broader economic planning, economic and social planning in communities, because the hazards have to be treated together. And some of the hazards are not the ones you'd expect, bushfire and flood. They're actually major impacts on the resilience of communities, like droughts, prolonged droughts, for example. So that's the second point. And maybe the third point I'd highlight is that there is, of course, there's a lot of funding and resourcing available, not enough, clearly, from the Commonwealth level and from state governments. But fundamentally, there's a lot the community itself can do. Justin was talking about some of those things, whether it's educating children. In a community that hasn't had a recent fire or recent disaster, then it takes very strong leadership and commitment from people in the community to make that happen, because people are distracted by other issues that seem more urgent to them. So I think those soft issues, whether it's working with school children, or working out how the most vulnerable members of society are going to be taken care of, sharing experience, some of the things Justin said, some of the experience we've seen in other other countries around the world, including developing countries. That's the third point I would make.
What would be your top 3 recommendations for us to focus on?
Well, I'd start with the macro issues, and sort of really start to scope out what the long-term outlook is for forest. What's the future weather in the next 50 to 100 years really looking like? How is the increase in fire weather, severe fire events in terms of frequency and their ultimate severity, and really use those as context to say, you know, the past isn't a sign of the future, and we do really have to start thinking about proactive adaptation. And I guess then understanding that level of intensity and that frequency, and imagining life in a decade or two's time really starts to help focus and hone what an adapted community could look like, not to an event nearby in recent history, but to what you can conceive or deduce from the weather and the fire events that could be driven by it. And I guess that really defines how important it is to weave bushfire resistant design that can handle any fire, like simply houses that can't burn down rather than houses that might not burn down. It isn't such a leap in terms of technical, you know, achievement or outcome, and it doesn't have to look like a concrete bunker. They're quite achievable outcomes, and I guess they come through conversation and demonstration.
Yeah, so thank you for joining us today and sharing your wisdom. You've left us with lots to think about and to continue through our journey of talking to people about becoming bushfire adapted in our small community, and we hope that this is relevant for other small communities.
So if you'd like to hear more from Justin or Robert, we'll share links to their latest publications, videos, and any further resources on our webpage, as I mentioned, at fireandrainconversations.org. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback from today's conversation, please get in touch via our website.
This is the first of our series. Our second series, second episode, has a theme around fire in the landscape, and we'll be speaking with Dr. Jack Pascoe, a Yuin man who's passionate about restoring productive systems in Gadigal country here in the Otways, and John Clark, a local leader and traditional owner representative of the land we're speaking on.
But I always thought that I'd see you again.